Good good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. My name's Karen Basra, and I'm the Institute of Directors Corporate Governance Policy Advisor, and I'm delighted to be joined here by Chris Hodge from Governance Perspectives to discuss the BHS case study. And as some of you may know, Chris has been in the world of corporate governance for many years. For almost a decade, Chris was Director of Corporate Governance at the UK's Financial Reporting Council, where he was responsible for developing and promoting the UK Corporate Governance Code, which, as many of you again will know, was one of perhaps the earliest and most influential codes for companies. And many of the kind of practices that he introduced, including board effectiveness reviews and public reporting on management of significant risks, were very much kind of Chris's innovations. Chris was also responsible for introducing the first national stewardship code for investors here in the UK in 2010. And as you'll know, many of you in your own countries will now have stewardship codes sort of emulating the UK's approach. More recently, Chris was the FRC Strategy Director, and it was in this capacity that he was responsible for developing the FRC's overall strategy for the years between 2016 and 2019, where he was overseeing and coordinating the FRC's external communications, public affairs, and international influencing efforts. And just before I hand over to Chris, I'd just like to outline some of the background of this particular webinar this morning. So as some of you will know, ecoDa's education program has existed since 2011, and the alumni group is now becoming fairly large. So, you know, these sorts of activities are very important, and we're glad to be hosting today's event. And the intention with this is to have a series of webinars around different kind of case studies, and today's is the first of that series. And then just some quick housekeeping. So I think everybody who's joining will be on silent mode to begin with, but you're very welcome to kind of put questions or comments to Chris and myself. And this is how you do it. You'll have to move your mouse towards the bottom of the screen, and to the Q&A section that you might be able to see there, and click on the button and write down your question or comment, and I'll then put your questions to Chris as we kind of wrap up today's session. And just before I hand over to Chris, it might be useful just to outline what Chris will be discussing today. So we're going to be discussing the kind of lead up to, or the decisions in the lead up to the sale of BHS for £1 to Dominic Chappell, and then the kind of fallout of the subsequent collapse and the regulatory responses that followed that collapse. And with that, I'll hand over to Chris.
Thanks very much, Karen. As it says on the slide there, and as Karen has already mentioned, the main focus today will be on the decisions and actions taken by the original owners of BHS and their board before it was sold, and on what happened as a result of the subsequent collapse in terms of regulation and other requirements in the UK. It's one of these case studies that we could happily talk for days about different parts of the details, including the behaviour of the new owners after the sale. But those will be the two main things we'll be covering. Wanted to start very briefly with just explaining some of the political context in 2016 in the UK when BHS collapsed, which is on the next slide, because that's relevant to the decisions that were subsequently taken by the UK government and others. So if we could move to the next slide, please, Georgie. Thank you. One of the reasons, if you look at the case study in the cold light of day, you might say it was a bad corporate failure, but it's not necessarily clear why it created such a scandal and outcry as it did in the UK. Partly that's to do with the company involved, which we'll come to on the next slide, but partly it's also to do with the general political and public debate at the time about the role of business. I won't go through all of the points on all of the slides. I think the intention is to, you can read them, and I think the intention is to share them with you after the webinar. But as it says there, the UK was still recovering from the financial crisis of the late 2000s. The economic policies that were put in place to try and deal with the consequences of that had led to a lot of people suffering economic difficulties, and it was felt that those people who had caused the problem, the bankers and others, had not been punished. So this has added to the general low opinion that many people in Britain have of business. There were also some topical examples, as it says, there are companies behaving badly to different stakeholder groups. Won't go into the details, but Sports Direct had been found to be mistreating employees. Tesco's had been treating their smaller suppliers very, very poorly, as a result of which many of whom had gone out of business. Add on to that a sort of almost an obsession in the UK with the executive pay of directors, and a growing criticism of shareholders for, as it was felt, having contributed to this by prioritising dividends over long-term investment and the long-term health of the company. Overall, the BHS came along at exactly the wrong time from their point of view in terms of becoming a sort of a poster case for regulatory change. The company itself, on the next slide, just a brief background to its history. It had a long and distinguished history in the British High Street. It had been around for about 90 years. At the time of its collapse, it says it was one of the major retailers, owned previously a public company, acquired by Sir Philip Green and his wife, who were the sole owners in 2000. It had been, and they extended their retail empire further after that. It had been profit-making for a long time, but became loss-making and had been so for about 6 or 7 years, including some quite substantial losses in the last couple of years of that period. In the run-up to the sale. The last bullet point there, the relevance of which will become apparent as we get into the rather complicated mechanics of what the ownership structure was, is that the Green family had a group known as the Taffeta Group, which moved various parts of their retail empire around under different headings and different subsidiaries and groups. It is a very complicated structure. We've briefly tried to highlight it on the next slide. There's no need to learn all of this. We won't be testing you on it later, but it's relevant to the section of the presentation where we look at the decisions that the board was made, the relevant board made. Because I say there's a holding company which was owned by Philip Green's wife, registered offshore, so not subject to UK legislation and regulation, and wholly owned. There were then 3 consecutive subsidiaries. There was Taffeta Investments, Taffeta Investments 2, which was a subsidiary of Taffeta Investments, and that was then the holding company for both BHS and the other retail outlets, the Arcadia Group that the Greens owned. Philip Green was on the board of all of the companies apart from the holding company. There was also overlap with other executive directors at the 3 levels below the holding company. And again, this was one of the criticisms that was subsequently raised about the structure. A gentleman called Lord Grabbanner, who you will be, fingers crossed, seeing in action later if the video is working, chaired the 2 intermediary levels, the Taffeta Investments and Taffeta Investments number 2. He didn't have any role in the holding company, and he was not on the board of BHS. And subsequent to the sale and the collapse, it emerged that there had been a series of financial transactions between BHS and other companies controlled by the Green family, so loans and other actions which essentially, as it was seen, subsequently took money out of BHS, moved them into other parts of the company that were perhaps more directly controlled by the Green family, and this became quite an issue following the sale and the collapse. So that's the structure. Moving on to, excuse me, the events of 2015, as Karen said in the introduction, BHS was sold as a loss-making business to this individual, Dominic Chappell or Chappell, in 2005 for a grand total of £1, which is roughly €1 now, I think, isn't it, at the current rates of exchange. Doubts and concerns were raised even at the time of the sale for the reasons that are stated on the slide. He was twice declared bankrupt, which could just be bad fortune rather than bad judgment on his case, but perhaps more relevantly, had no known retail background, and none of the backers of his purchase had any retail background either. As well as the, while Philip Green did write off £200 million, as it says there, in order to enable the sale to go through, as well as the loss-making business, Dominic Chappell did acquire significant pension losses and other liabilities, so that the whole package was one that was perhaps on the face of it not an attractive purchase, and would explain why it was sold so cheaply. What then happened, as it says, within 12 months the company had gone into administration, major job losses not only at the employees but and suppliers, and a significant deficit in the pension fund. And it subsequently emerged during the course of various regulatory inquiries that in the run-up to the administration, Dominic Chappell had been moving, rather like Philip Green was accused of doing, had been moving money out of BHS into other funds and companies that he himself owned. So the two of them were seen as having behaved perhaps in a rather similar way. So this is the point where the company collapses. It's early mid-2016. And immediately certain questions start being asked, not only about the behaviour of the new owners in the last 12 months, and they were investigated, but that's not the main focus of the case study today, but also about what had been done prior to the sale, who had taken the decision. There's sort of three questions that were asked essentially, which are on the next slide, if we could move to that, please. Who took the decision to sell? What due diligence was undertaken by the board before the sale, and what consideration was given to the potential impact on employees, pension holders, suppliers. So did the board of Taffeta Investments, or Taffeta Investments 2, depending on which one it was, and even now I get confused, I must be honest, to what extent, if at all, did they think about those sort of aspects and any expectations, obligations they had towards those groups of people before they then agreed to sale. And at this point, we hopefully will be able to show you a video which is taken from a parliamentary committee which scrutinised the circumstances around the sale. The gentleman being interviewed is Lord Grabbanner, who is, as I said, the chairman of the two companies in the middle of that chain, neither the holding company or BHS, but the ones that were essentially the BHS holding company. And this is a parliamentary committee that met in, I think it was 2016, 2017, and he's being asked to explain the events leading up to the sale. So hopefully this will work, but we'll find out. We're having a few technical problems before you joined us, but
could I just ask, in terms of Companies Act, it states that directors need to exercise independent judgment. Lord Governor, how did you demonstrate that independent judgment with BHS?
Well, what we did was that we appointed a subgroup of the board of executive officers of the board, and apart from Ian sitting immediately next to me, the other three persons in front of you, along with Sir Philip Green, represented that subgroup. And we appointed that subgroup to look at the question of the possible disposal of BHS. And they discharged that exercise throughout, which is actually the real reason why my own knowledge of the various events as described in my statement is rather limited.
But you can't abdicate responsibility, can you?
No, I wouldn't.
You may have delegated to a subgroup, but you need to be kept informed of what was going on in terms of what could be, a major divestment of a business.
Yes, I'm not trying to, so to speak, get rid of any obligations that I may have had, but obviously the subgroup was full of the relevant expertise. It had pensions expertise, it had real estate or property expertise, and it had detailed financial information about BHS. And I had never been a director of BHS at any time, and I never was. So that it was entirely appropriate that that group of persons should be responsible for that exercise. At the end of the day, it was necessary for the deal to be done, if it was going to be done, by TIL number 2 as the vendor. That's perfectly true. But in relation to that, I believe that the responsibilities were properly discharged.
How did you keep yourself up to date with developments regarding the sale?
Well, I can take you through the timeline very, very briefly. That we, as a board, were told that at the beginning of, or near the end of January of 2015, that there had been some expressions of interest from third parties in the purchase of BHS. Though I don't think...
But you weren't told who they were?
No, at no stage was I told who they were. The 10th of March, there was a nighttime board meeting to which I was not invited, but it was quorate. And I did not know...
The board of which company?
TIL, the top board. But
and you weren't invited?
No, I was not invited, and I saw no papers, but it was a quorate board, and the quorate board consisted of the people in the executive team that I have described. So it was entirely appropriate that those people should be making that judgment.
Forgive me, my lord, there's a complex structure here, and I'm getting
very complex,
and I'm getting confused.
I'm sorry.
In terms of the board of TIL,
yes.
Who's chair of that company?
I am.
And you weren't invited to that board meeting?
That's quite right.
Do you feel aggrieved by that?
No, because
if there was I'm chair of the Biz Select Committee. If there was a meeting of the Select Committee and I wasn't invited, I'd be really angry.
Well, the point is that we had appointed this subgroup to investigate the BHS, the possibility of disposing of BHS, and it was that subgroup that formed itself into the board meeting on the night of the 10th of March. And then on the 11th of March, and they approved the proposed sale. On the 11th of March, the transaction was done. On the 16th of March, and this was the first time I came into the story, on the 16th of March...
So 5 days after it had happened?
Yes.
Yeah.
On the 16th of March, the Tabata 2 board meeting records, in effect, a technical resolution to ratify the transaction done on the 11th of March.
To what extent do you think during that process you were able to fulfil the general duties of a director, let alone a chairman, under the Companies Act?
Well, I believe I discharged them properly. My duties in relation to a solvent business, which fortunately this is and always has been, was first of all a fiduciary duty to the company, and secondly a duty to take account of the position of the shareholders. And that was my responsibility, and I believe I fully discharged it.
You said in your statement that Sir Philip Green's view, which was supported by the TIL board, i.e. I assume you, was that if possible BHS should be sold as a going concern. But how could it survive, given that you described the deterioration in the business as so great that the only practical alternative was to place the company into administration?
Well, that would depend upon the quality of the business plan that was being proffered by the buyer and the assessment of that business plan by the people on my left.
With which you weren't involved at all?
That's exactly right.
So how could the TIL board take that view then, given that you didn't know what was going on?
Well, you're suggesting that it's true. I did not know. But the appropriate persons on the board, whose task it was to know what was going on, did know what was going on, and we relied upon their judgment and their skill.
Do you think it's unusual that a chairman doesn't know what's going on in his board?
Well, you're putting that in a rather loaded way, and I don't accept the way you've put it.
So your answer is no, it's perfectly usual for a chairman not to be invited to a board meeting, not to receive the papers, and not to know who the buyer of the company, of whom ultimately he is the chairman, being sold.
I think in the particular context of this transaction, bearing in mind the expertise of the people whose task it was to do the exercise on behalf of the board, is entirely an unsurprising result. This is a private company.
Hello. Hopefully you're all able to hear that. If not, you've had a rather dull last 6 minutes looking at some silent movie of some men talking. Just to recap on the main points from that, which we wanted to highlight. Well, first is the decision to sell the company, and the terms on which to do so was delegated entirely to a subcommittee which consisted of the controlling owner and the executive directors, not taken by the board as a whole. And not only that, but the board as a whole, as personified by Lord Grabbanner there, were not even informed of the sale or the identity of the buyer until 5 days after the transaction had been completed. And there were many issues that were raised by the Parliamentary Committee, but the particular bit that this last part of that was focusing on was an assessment of whether the board had carried out the legal duties expected of directors under UK law. And there are two, as I'm sure is the case in all your countries, there are many duties in law for directors, but the two that are particularly relevant here is the requirement to exercise due care and attention in carrying out their duties, and the duty to act in the interests of the members of the company. And Lord Grabbanner's view, as you heard at the end there, was that by appointing what they considered to be an appropriate subcommittee which had the necessary expertise to make those decisions on behalf of the board, they were fully discharging their duties to display due care and attention. And that in addition, by focusing on the interests of the members of the company, which is the shareholders, essentially, although implicitly, if the owners of the company, the Green family, were content with the terms on which the deal was being done, then that test to act in the interests of the members of the company had been passed. And that, we'll come back to the sort of UK law position on this in a minute, but that was, as an overriding consideration, in his view, was that those two tests for directors' duties, as I say, had been passed, and that therefore the directors had carried out all that could reasonably be expected of them. Excuse me. You won't be surprised to hear, probably, from the tone of the question, that the UK Parliamentary Committee took a slightly different view. And on the next, returning to the slides, I won't read all of this, but these are the two main findings in relation to this particular aspect of the sale. One was that actually the board had not carried out its duty. It had allowed the interests of the Green family, of the controlling owners, to override all other considerations that they should have been taking account of as members of the board, and essentially that they didn't provide independent challenge and oversight that were expected, or that the employees, the suppliers, the pensioners could reasonably have expected the board to undertake. And so this was an extremely critical report. And it led in part to a number of different pieces of follow-up action, some of them specifically to do with BHS, some of them linked back to the broader debate that I started with about the role of business in society and concerns that too much focus was given to shareholders, both in public listed companies but also privately owned companies, and so a series of actions were put in place, which are summarised on the next slide. Apologies for the coughing. The first is the impact for individual directors. Although we didn't focus in that part of the presentation on Dominic Chabol's behaviour, he has now been banned from being a director, as he was the owner in charge at the point that the company went into administration, and given some of the actions that were revealed around transactions in the run-up to going into administration, he was banned. The decision was taken some months ago. The actual length of the sentence, if that's the right expression, was only announced a couple of days ago, and he's been banned from acting as a director of any organisation for 10 years. Philip Green, however, and this was quite controversial, was not banned. The regulators who looked into this concluded that, as it says there, he may have acted immorally, but technically what he did was not illegal. That if you take a minimum interpretation of what the legal duties of a director are, on that interpretation, which should be the one that they assumed the courts would apply, he had probably done what was necessary. but the clear implication was that actually that wasn't adequate anymore. So in response to that, last year the government announced that it would have some legislation, as it says there, to ensure greater accountability of directors when they're selling distressed subsidiaries. Now, what that means in practice, nobody knows, because that legislation hasn't come forward yet, and may not for some time, because as you may have noticed, the British government and Parliament have been a bit tied up with other issues since then. So I'm not able to share with you any more detail of what that legislation might require if it ever comes to pass, and it's by no means guaranteed that it will happen. But nonetheless, there was a lot of attention paid on whether there should be a higher level of expectation, a greater burden of proof, if you like, that the subsidiary was being sold into safer hands, or into someone who might be able to apply the level of care and attention that was necessary, than seems to be the case in the current and is required by law at the moment. The second part of that, which again has not happened, is more to do with Dominic Chappell's behaviour, and wanting to recover where there are cases where someone has taken money out of a company shortly before it goes into administration. The proposal is that insolvency practitioners should be able to reclaim some of that money. Again, whether this will happen or what form it will take when it does, we don't know. The next two, the bullet points, are both things that have been acted on, and are the ones that are partly inspired by, at least in the first case, is partly inspired by BHS. The second, probably primarily inspired by BHS, but also by the other cases that I mentioned at the beginning, such as Sports Direct and their employees, Tesco and their suppliers, and there were other examples in the UK at the time. And the view there was that the law, as it is currently applied in the UK, gives too much weight to shareholders, not enough weight to other stakeholders. This was the case. And at the next slide, I'll come on to what the law currently states and what debate was had about this. And the final bullet point, no need to go back, but we'll come on to that, was that there are now, for the first time, legal requirements on privately owned companies above a certain size to report on their governance arrangements, which is the BHS law, if you like. So this section 172 became quite a big debate. It's slightly arcane in some ways, but essentially what this says, as you can see, is that while the legal duty is to the members of the company, which has been interpreted in some quarters as meaning the shareholders. There's a debate about that, but that's how it's broadly been interpreted. The board of the companies should, in making decisions, also take account of a number of other factors and considerations, what you might broadly call stakeholders. So employees, suppliers, customers, the environment and the local community, high standards of business conduct, which I think is the bit where you might have perhaps caught some of the directors on if you were applying these. So these different expectations have been in law for a while, and at one point when the law was being drafted back in the early 2000s, it was intended that each of these should be a separate duty. But it was pointed out, not unreasonably, that if you made all of them a legal duty, you would put any director in a position where inevitably they had to break one legal duty in order to meet another one. There is no way you can tick all of those boxes with some of the decisions that the boards have to take. So this sort of subsidiary level, if you like, law was written. And now the debate that was had in 2015, 2016 was whether actually they've got this the wrong way around. And one suggestion, which had some support for a while, was that, if you like, you flip the first two duties, so that the primary duty, the overriding duty, is to the long-term health of the company, and that you relegate the duty to the members, to the shareholders, to the same level as other stakeholders. That was considered. It was, in the end, the government decided not to do that. What the interpretation they came to was that actually the law, as it stands, if it had been implemented properly by boards of directors, was still fine. Actually, it wasn't. The fault was not in the law itself, but in the fact that it was perhaps misunderstood, or in some cases directors had read the first bit and then not bothered to read anything from A to F, so focused purely on the overriding duty. So there was no change made to the law in the event, but what the government did introduce was some new reporting requirements, because what it has done, I think it also recognised that thankfully, although there are more high-profile cases like this than one would like, it's not the generality of businesses that are having instances like BHS. So to impose new legal duties on all companies in response to the poor behaviour, as it's seen of a small number of them, was perhaps disproportionate. So instead, what they have required, and we'll on the next slide, this is set out briefly, is that all public and private companies who are required to produce annual reports must now include a section on how they have applied the subsidiary elements of Section 172 to their decision-making process. What this actually looks like in practice, we don't yet know. The companies aren't required to report on this until next year. And I think a lot of them are struggling a little, frankly, with working out how you report meaningfully. You can include a long section that says these are the processes we follow and this is what we incorporate in board papers. How meaningful that really is as an indication of the way in which the board thinks and the way in which the board weights things, I don't know. Some people slightly optimistically think there will be case studies which say we took this judgment here. I think that may be a little unrealistic to expect boards to come out and say we decided on this occasion not to pay too much attention to the interests of this particular group, because I think that's a slightly dangerous potentially way for boards to start disclosing. So the usefulness of this disclosure to the people who campaigned for it we remains to be seen. As it mentions there, there are also some additional employments for larger employers about how they've engaged specifically with their employees. In parallel with a debate around the legal duties, there was at one point the government was considering mandating, excuse me, having workforce representatives on the board. Apologies, I have a bit of a cold, as you probably gathered. So that again was not pursued. There was something in the corporate governance code that asked boards to describe how they're doing, but this was a way of nudging companies towards thinking about these things while not mandating it. The final new reporting requirement, and this is almost the end of the presentation, is for the first time, large privately owned companies are now expected to report on their corporate governance arrangements. The reason this wasn't a requirement previously goes back a bit to the interpretation of the duties of directors, and as you saw on the previous slide, the requirement that it was primarily duty was to the members of the company, the shareholders. And the way, certainly in the UK, and I think in most other countries this has developed, is the focus, therefore, of governance codes and disclosure requirements was on accountability to the shareholders. And the distinction was drawn between private and publicly owned companies because in publicly owned companies, the shareholders don't typically sit around the board, well, not all of them anyway. So there is a need for some sort of framework of reporting to them so that they can be reassured that the company is being well governed and run in their interests. And that's where the origins of the codes and reporting on codes comes from. Whereas in a privately owned company like BHS, where the controlling shareholder sits on the board and is directly involved in the oversight and the decision making, there is no need for that sort of framework of reporting. Where the view, certainly in the UK, changed is if you're now redefining the purpose of directors' duties or reinterpreting the existing directors' duties to say it is not just about accountability to the shareholders but to these other stakeholders as well, then that distinction to a degree falls away, because large private companies are just as capable of having a significant impact for good or ill on their employees, suppliers, local communities and so on, as large public companies are. So this is the rationale that's been used to introduce some reporting requirements for large private companies in the UK for the first time. As with the other reporting requirements I mentioned, none of these have actually been implemented yet, so it remains to be seen what they say and how useful they are. What has happened already, though, is that a business-led group supported by the government and the regulators got together and created a set of voluntary corporate governance principles for large private companies. The IOD, I believe, was also participating in that. Indeed, the IOD, like many ecoDa members, already has an equivalent code for companies, and so that was part of the inspiration for this exercise. And on the next slide, it will briefly explain to you what it covers. I won't go into any details, but what has happened since it was published is that the Financial Reporting Council, the relevant regulator and the government have both said you don't have to apply these principles. It's an entirely voluntary code, but if you report using the structure of these principles, then the assumption will be that you have met your new legal duty to report on your governance arrangements. So it's a sort of set of prompts to companies to say, make sure you explain what you're doing on the 6 principles that are there. And it's felt that that's a useful way for companies to structure their own thinking about how they then report. In terms of the specifics of what's happened in the UK, that's all we had to cover. As I said, none of this has actually been implemented yet. So the impact of it and the success or otherwise of it in terms of greater accountability or changing behaviour, we wait to see. But there are some more general observations to make from the BHS case about any company that has a controlling interest, whether that be a shareholder, the state, a family group, whatever that is. And we'll finish with that on the next and final slide. And then I'll hand back to Karen to do a bit of talking while I sip some water. These are some general observations, as I say, about if you from the outside are looking at a company with a controlled interest, or if you perhaps are considering taking up an appointment as a director at such a company, some of the indicators that you might look for to see how confident you can be that the controlling interest is one that is being used, is being devoted to the good of the company, perhaps rather than to the narrower interest of the individual or group that has that controlling share. Many of these will be familiar to you. Many of them are sort of standard good governance practices, independent directors, particularly in key positions such as the chair and the audit committee, a formal shareholder agreement where the shareholder does not sit on the board, or even where they do, as to the matters in which the shareholder will or will not take a direct interest, and with those which are left to the operational control of the board and the management. Clearly, conflicts of interest and related party transactions are a bigger issue for those sort of companies than they are for others with a dispersed ownership. So look to see how robust and transparent those are. For public listed companies, which just doesn't apply in the case of BHS, then there's a debate going on, certainly in many European countries at the moment, including now I see in the UK apparently, about the use of dual class or other types of share structures that have some ability not to give a greater weight to the in voting terms to the controlling shareholder, which need not be a bad thing at all. So there are arguments both ways, but it's something to just look out for if you find yourselves in a situation where, as happens with some of the US tech IPOs, where I think the most extreme case was the founder had 10,000 votes for every one that an external shareholder had. That you may think that goes a little far, perhaps, and also equal treatment in terms of access to information, which is difficult when you have one of them sitting on the board and the others are externally. But those are some of the indicators, or the factors that you perhaps, as I say, if you're thinking of taking up a position with such a company and want to be sure that your ability to have a positive influence, your own reputational issues and risks are things to perhaps reflect on. I'll stop at that point and hand over to Karen. I think I need to.
Great, thank you, Chris. I think that was a really interesting presentation, and I think really drew out kind of quite a lot. I think obviously this kind of case really shone a light on the scale and significance of private companies, whereas governance previously had very much focused on public companies, listed companies, and in this case clearly shone a light on private companies, and the weights principles were a response very much to this scandal. I think we've got a couple of questions, and if there's any more questions from the audience, I'll gladly put those to Chris. So I think we've got one here from Jean, who asks, Jean rather, kind of why the board members didn't react to the process, and why they're kind of delegated decision making to a subcommittee when they're doing that, Chris. Because I mean, clearly that's what the video that we showed highlighted, and it looked as though kind of Lord Grabiner had no idea what was going on, and was happy to delegate.
I mean, I think that was the question that the Parliament wanted to get to the root of, and it's not obvious why. I mean, I think even at the time he was giving the evidence, it is difficult to see how the interpretation that he chose to place on the legal duties of directors to exercise due diligence and care could be met by saying, we have given this to a subgroup, you don't need to tell us anything, we trust you. I mean, it's just good that he felt able to trust them, but I think on any normal interpretation, that would not pass the test of what was due diligence, and indeed that was the conclusion of Parliament and the regulators subsequently. So I think this is the assumption is essentially that, and this may be a bit unfair to him, that Lord Grabiner was one of a number of people who was happy to take Sir Philip Green's money to provide a veneer of respectability to whatever the Green family wanted to do, and that was really what motivated him in his position as the chair. One suspects. I hope he's not listening and won't sue me for saying that.
And Chris, I think clearly, you know, he was in the upper chamber of the House, was a respected kind of individual, and it sounds like he was very much giving that kind of patina of legitimacy to what.
Yes, I mean, I think what was interesting is that it used to be the case with public listed companies 20, 30 years ago, I think, before governance first became an issue, and people began focusing on what the role of the board of directors really should be. Certainly in the UK, if you went back to the 1970s, 1980s, before some of the financial and the economic problems in the 80s, you would typically see members of the House of Lords, retired judges, retired admirals, these sorts of people who may well have been excellent individuals who contributed meaningfully to the discussion of the board, but you suspect were primarily there to add a respectability and credibility and to look good on the letterhead. Certainly in the UK, and I think this is generally true now in public listed companies for a long time, and in most many private companies, it's long since been recognised that actually what you want are people who are there who can actually bring the attributes that you need for the board to undertake its role of scrutiny, supervisory, contributing to the strategy, and so on. And the profile of your typical director in the public listed companies of the UK and I think elsewhere is very different to what it was 30 years ago. I think it's still the case in some private companies, I don't want to generalise on the basis of BHS, that perhaps that hasn't changed as much. I remember when we go back 10 years, for example, Northern Rock, which was a building society, a private building society whose board had developed essentially into a retail bank over the years, but their board structure, their chair was a science journalist whose only qualification for chairing the bank, the building society, was that his father had done it before him. And so I think there is at the board level, there is publicly listed companies that perhaps move more fast to recognise what you really need from an effective board of directors than some private companies have, but they're sort of taking the same route, but maybe a little bit further behind.
And just quickly to add on that, I guess the sector that's developed most quickly in that respect is financial services, where there's a separate regime. In
there's a huge amount of financial scrutiny, whether the ownership structure is less important than the fact that they're regulated. So.
And I mean, a separate question. I mean, I mean, really, can any you know, I mean, in what way was the kind of existing legislation and the kind of regulatory framework that was in place at the point of this kind of scandal? I mean, in what way was it lacking? Why wasn't it prevented?
I think this was the whole debate that was had for some time. I think there are three. If you're looking at the effectiveness of any regulatory regime, there are sort of three things to look at: are the rules, the laws, right? Are they clearly defined, and is it obvious or clear what you need to do? How well are they observed by those people who are being regulated, and what sort of monitoring is carried out, or sanctions or enforcement where appropriate? And I think there was a debate about whether the Section 172 that I showed you and the related duties for directors about care and diligence and so on were the right duties. And I think the feeling or the conclusion that was drawn, and I think it's probably the right one, is that there's nothing wrong with them as a set of legal duties. There may be certainly for greater clarity, particularly about whether, if it's in the interest of the member's company, that means it overrules everything, or whether it's more nuanced.
Yep.
Which is, and there appeared in some cases, and again, I don't want to generalise on the basis of a small number of cases, that they weren't necessarily those duties in particular weren't necessarily being implemented as methodically, if you like, by all companies. And so the focus of the action that was then taken was more about in the hope that if you require companies to report publicly on this, it will lead the boards to take rather more care to make sure they have done this properly.
Yeah.
It's not going to get them out of having to make some very difficult decisions that will include trade-offs between different groups. There's no way you can ever eliminate that, but it will at least hopefully mean that a more robust decision-making process results. That's the hope. We'll wait and see whether that happens. I think the other area, though, is and it goes back to the point I made right at the beginning about a perception, at least, that directors can behave very badly and aren't really punished for it. So it goes back at least as far as the financial crisis in the UK, and that is an issue.
Yeah.
I think I think there has been a perceived weakness in the enforcement and the sanctions regimes in the UK, and some of the actions that we talked about in the case of insolvency as potential gaps in the legislation. I think there probably are potential gaps in legislation. Whether we'll see them filled is an open question at the moment. So.
And Chris, just to kind of rewind slightly on that. I mean, just thinking about the video that we played, the kind of select committee process is something that's now well embedded in the UK. So in recent weeks, we've also had the executives of kind of Thomas Cook up in front of the same committee. And this is kind of a regular thing that happens now. And I wonder how effective you think that is as a sanction for bad behaviour. Obviously, it's not a formal sanction, but I wonder whether you think that has any effect.
I'm not sure I would see the role of the parliamentary committees as a sanction as such. I mean, I think it's a very strong system. It's perhaps the one bit of the UK Parliament and government that is still worth boasting about compared to some of the others. But we'll pass on from that. I think where it is very useful is that it's a form of holding both the people who are seen to have behaved badly, whether they be companies or the power. The committees have the power to require evidence from anybody. Not everybody turns up, but there is no formal limit on their controls. But it's an ability to hold them to account, but it's also an ability to look at the actions of the regulators, the governments who set these regimes, and say, actually, we don't think that's working. So it has a degree of independence from the regulators sometimes.
Yeah.
Because you might conceive a situation where, say, the insolvency service in this case was called to give evidence. They might be more inclined to be rather defensive about and not terribly forthcoming about shortcomings in either the way they acted or something. So to have this sort of independent scrutiny that says, this is our analysis, and the quality is variable, but actually some of them are very good, and say, this is what we think the weaknesses are, now over to you, to the governments to act on it, I think is where, and in this case it has prompted a number of actions from the government, as I say, whether they're going to be effective. Whether they're the right actions, we wait to see.
Sure. And then again, just on that committee, I think one of the kind of enlightening kind of quotes that I kind of caught when watching the session was Sir Philip Green, who was the previous owner of the business, had sort of said, if I give you my plane and you tell me that you're a great driver and you kind of crash into the first mountain, is that really my fault? So, I mean, my thought just kind of following that is, can directors really be held accountable for events that occur after they've sold the business?
Good question. I think the view that was taken by the committee and the view that I think was taken by the Regulators and Solvency Service is that while you can't be held responsible for actions taken after you sold it, if you didn't test out or as to whether they were indeed a great pilot, then you had some responsibility. And in this case, it was felt that if it was known that the people buying it from you had no retail experience, had a best checkered previous business career, some of the financial claims that they made about their ability to financially support the company going on were not tested and proved to be illusory. I think the view was taken, and I think rightly, that you didn't exercise due diligence. If you consider that you have, up until the point you've sold it, you still have a responsibility to think about the best interests of your employees, and say, well, if you sell it having a pretty good idea, as I think they must have had in this case, that it wasn't going to work out. And it was seen probably rightly as an opportunity to essentially cut their losses, give them the write-off 200 million quid, offload it before the money, the losses were greater. Then I think they have a responsibility, not as much perhaps as responsibility as the directors of the company when it went into administration, but certainly some responsibility for knowingly. I don't think you could say they acted in any way in the interests of their other stakeholders in that particular case.
So I think perhaps to kind of extend Sir Philip's metaphor there, it's more akin here to sort of selling an aeroplane to a man who's crashed an aeroplane sort of twice before and not checking whether he had a license.
I don't want to get too much into this death plunge analogy, but it's not as if you're selling an empty aeroplane. There are lots of people on the aeroplane, your employers, your customers, your suppliers. So you have a responsibility to the passengers, I think, as well as the plane itself.
Great. And then I think just to close, if there are no other questions from the floor, I just had one kind of final question, Chris, and it was really around, obviously we're now expecting regulators to kind of police and monitor private company reporting. Do you think really any regulator can really be equipped to do that? I mean, it seems to me that's a very difficult task, really, to do. And I just wondered whether you had any thoughts on that as a regulator.
I think it's an open question. I think the system of public reporting by listed companies works, if you think it works, because the external shareholders have an interest in looking at what is written, engaging with the company, hopefully in a constructive way, not always, and so you can see the purpose of that as a means of accountability and engagement. I think with a private company, the question is who is going to read these things, and it's not obvious that you have an audience for these reports other than the regulators. And although the way the regulations have been written, it only applies to a few thousand companies. It is difficult to imagine any regulator is going to go through several thousand annual reports of private companies and look for these. And it's also, I think, quite difficult to know how you would assess the reporting anyway. I mean, people will need to learn how to do that once these reports start happening. But if they're saying, please tell us what you do against the following broad areas, how you would work out just from reading an annual report that the company is perhaps not living up to the standards that are expected of directors, I'm not sure how you would spot the clues, if you like, in that reporting. So I'm not sure. I'm not 100% convinced that it's actually going to be effective in raising the behaviour or ensuring that those hopefully small number of private companies where there is a need to improve the diligence of the directors, is going to have that effect, because it lacks the other pressures that publicly listed companies have that incentivises them to do so.
I mean, is it perhaps a kind of behavioural prompt though, and is it about sort of raising expectations rather than thinking that this is a kind of panacea? Is it more about...
I mean, I think that's part of the rationale, and it may be, I mean, I'm not saying it isn't a good idea to have things like the weights principles out there to encourage companies to think about it. Many, including the weights group themselves, are already doing these things. But if you're looking for it as a way of identifying future failures, I don't think it will work, as a means of preventing another BHS. I'm not sure that this is the way to do it. I'm not sure there is a way to do it. I think it may be that more severe sanctions might be a greater deterrent, to pour on the late. No, I can't remember the French phrase, but it's to encourage the others. Encourage your apologies to French speakers out there for my appalling mangling of your language.
Fantastic, Chris. I mean, unless you had any kind of final closing thoughts.
Before my voice disappears altogether, I'll probably going to stop.
Great. So I think for the sake of Chris's voice, we'll bring things to a close there, and just thank everyone for taking part and giving us questions and listening. And I believe that Xiaoji and the team at ecoDa are happy to share these slides, and hopefully this has been a useful session. Okay, well, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much, everyone.